Since the birth of civilization, tyrannical rulers have plagued mankind. Driven by an insatiable appetite for power, such individuals have done their best to control both the minds and bodies of their subjects. Seen in this light, the history of civilization is very much a history of varying degrees of human enslavement. Especially in the case of more authoritarian regimes, it has been common to assume that the masses are purely victims in their enslavement, unable to mount any form of resistance due to the threat of force wielded by those in power. In the 16th century, the French philosopher Étienne de la Boétie challenged this view in his essay The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. All governments, he argued, including the most tyrannical, can only rule for extended durations if they have the general support of the populace. Not only are those in power vastly outnumbered by those over whom they rule, but governments rely on the subjugated populations to provide them with a continual supply of resources and manpower. If one day enough people refused to obey and stopped surrendering their wealth and property, their oppressors would, in the words of La Boétie, become naked and undone and as nothing, just as, when the root receives no nourishment, the branch withers and dies. Hence, mass submission to even the most oppressive political regimes is always a voluntary servitude, one based on popular consent, as La Boétie explains. Obviously, there is no need of fighting to overcome this single tyrant, for he is automatically defeated if the country refuses consent to its own enslavement. It is not necessary to deprive him of anything, but simply to give him nothing. It is therefore the inhabitants themselves who permit, or rather bring about, their own subjection, since by ceasing to submit they would put an end to their servitude. A people enslaves itself, cuts its own throat when, having a choice between being vassals and being free men, it deserts its liberties and takes on the yoke, gives consent to its own misery, or rather, apparently welcomes it. In this video, we'll explore La Boétie's insights as to why people throughout history and into the modern day have acted against their best interests and consented to their enslavement. Most animals display a natural instinct to be free. When an attempt is made to capture an animal, it flees in terror or else reacts with fierce aggression. When taken from its natural habitat and placed in captivity, its innate vigor atrophies and is replaced by lethargy and despondency. The successful domestication of a species, therefore, usually requires numerous generations of selective breeding in order to eradicate the animal's instinct to roam and live free. La Boétie asserts that in human beings this instinct for freedom is especially pronounced. Various social factors, however, have atrophied this natural instinct over time to the point where now the very love of liberty no longer seems natural. One of these factors, according to La Boétie, is the powerful influence of custom, or in other words, our tendency to become habituated to the social and political conditions we were born into. Just as an animal born in captivity knows nothing of the freedom it lacks and hence does not resist its chains, so too those born into state slavery lack the knowledge of what it means to be free, and thus tend to accept their servitude as if it were natural. When one spends their formative years observing those around them not resisting their oppressors, but accepting them and even adoring them, the effects of custom tend to override the natural instinct for freedom, and submission becomes habitual. This socialization into state slavery is analogous to the story of the ancient king Mithridates, who was said to have habituated himself to poison by drinking small amounts over a long period of time. Like him, writes La Boétie, we learn to swallow and not to find bitter the venom of servitude. Or as he further explains, it is true that in the beginning men submit under constraint and by force, but those who come after them obey without regret and perform willingly what their predecessors had done because they had to. This is why men born under the yoke and then nourished and reared in slavery are content, without further effort, to live in their native circumstance, unaware of any other state or right, and considering as quite natural the conditions into which they were born. But custom alone does not account for the readiness with which people consent to their servitude, as ruling classes have long known that to maintain power, they must play an active role in engineering consent. Plays, farces, spectacles, gladiators, strange beasts, medals, pictures, writes La Boétie, and other such opiates. These were for ancient peoples the bait towards slavery, the price of their liberty, the instruments of tyranny. In the modern day, these instruments of tyranny have changed form, but their essence remains the same. The endless supply of mindless diversions provided by the mass media and entertainment industry, the numbing effects of pharmaceutical drugs, and the dramatic farce of political elections all serve to distract the attention of the populace away from the reality of their enslavement. Another tactic for engineering consent used by ancient tyrants was analogous to what we call the welfare state today. Laboiti notes that on select days of the year, ruling classes used to distribute bread, wine, and a little bit of money to their subjects, and soon after those who were content and satiated would cry out, "Long live the king." The fools did not realize, Laboiti writes, that they were merely recovering a portion of their own property, and that their ruler could not have given them what they were receiving without having first taken it from them. But the proverbial bread and circuses are not the only instruments of tyranny, for ruling classes have long attempted to evoke not only the consent, but the adoration and reverence of their subjects by co-opting techniques used by religions to make their authority appear sacred. Myths, rituals, the use of religious and cult symbolism, and the construction of buildings symbolizing power and authority and resembling places of worship have long been used by ruling classes to borrow, in the words of Laboiti, a stray bit of divinity to bolster up their evil ways. Despite the fact that voluntary servitude to a political ruling class has been the norm throughout history, Laboiti does not consider it inevitable that this situation will continue indefinitely. For just as there have always existed those who seek to rule and exploit others, so too in all ages there exist individuals who instinctively rebel against any form of servitude, and thus are tortured by the chains which others appear not to notice. Even if liberty had entirely perished from the earth, Laboiti writes, such men would have to invent it. For them, slavery has no satisfactions, no matter how well disguised. Those who comprise this elite vanguard of freedom devote much of their time to educating themselves and developing their critical capacities for the sake of awakening others to the nefarious and deceptive nature of political rule. This work is done in the realization that if a critical mass becomes aware of their enslavement and of the true value of freedom, voluntary servitude on a mass scale will end quite abruptly, for as Laboiti explains, from all these indignities, such as the very beasts of the field would not endure, you can deliver yourselves if you try, not by taking action, but merely by willing to be free. Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him, like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break into pieces. For hundreds of years, freedom reigned as a preeminent value in Western civilization, and with the abolition of slavery in the mid-19th century, the tide of liberty seemed destined to overpower those forces looking to hold humanity in the chains of servitude. By the early 20th century, however, this trend was quickly reversed, as governments began to exert control over ever more areas of life. Today, there is little one can do without the state, or what Nietzsche called the coldest of all cold monsters, either taking its cut, dictating how it's to be done, or at the very least, watching and recording our every move. We should not despair, however, for power still resides with the people, or so we are told. Being fortunate enough to live in democracies, we choose our leaders, and so determine our fate. But how much power does the ability to vote really give us? Major elections, especially for those who favor freedom, appear to be nothing but a choice between evils, the lesser of which is often difficult to discern. Rather than real choice, perhaps we only have the illusion of choice. Perpetual war, high taxes, mass surveillance, stifling regulation, corporate welfare, the inhumane war on drugs, and an increasing move towards censorship of all those who fail to toe the statist line seem inevitable no matter who is elected. Those who still have faith in the system will claim that we just need to vote the right people into power, people willing to end the abuses of the state. This view, however, tends to diminish or completely overlooks the existence of powerful forces which make it far more likely that morally corrupt, power-hungry individuals who favor the growth of the state will rise to the top. The worst among us, not the best, are most likely to rule in modern democracies. Many factors contribute to this unfortunate state of affairs, and primary among them is the type of person most likely to enter the field of politics. For politics, like all professions, is more attractive to some people than others. One does not choose to become an emergency room doctor if they are uncomfortable with the sight of blood, and likewise, one is unlikely to enter politics if they are uncomfortable with the nature of modern political rule. What, then, is the nature of this rule? First and foremost, government is an institution that relies on the use or threat of force to achieve its ends. But while government has always been coercive in nature, The degree to which coercion or state power has been accepted as legitimate in a society has fluctuated over time. The West, for many years, was built around the ideal of limited government. Free markets and other social institutions, free of the coercive nature of the state, were viewed as crucial elements in a stable and prospering society. No longer is this the case. The script has been flipped. Instead of governments being limited in what they are permitted to do, it is now the state that greatly limits what we, as individuals, can and cannot do. This expanded role of the state and the immense power at its disposal attracts, like a moth to a flame, the most power-hungry among us. Political power is unfortunately seen by many as the only power worth having, and those with the greatest thirst for power see the state as the best vehicle for satiating their desire. It should not be surprising that most political candidates openly campaign on the expansion of the state, for state power, if victorious, becomes their power. Not only does modern politics attract the power-hungry, but to make matters worse, it attracts power-hungry individuals of an excessively narcissistic and conceited temperament. Those who enter politics by and large prefer the reign of intellect to the reign of liberty. They are men and women who believe they should be granted the use of state power to remake the world according to their vision. Rarely is it acknowledged that what this entails is a replacement of the spontaneous order-generating processes of the social world, which coordinate the plans of individuals, with a single plan devised by politicians and bureaucrats and enforced with the use or threat of violence. Why the transfer of decisions, asks Thomas Sowell, from the individuals and organizations directly involved, often depicted collectively and impersonally as the market, to third parties who pay no price for being wrong, should be expected to produce better results for society at large is a question seldom asked, much less answered. The presumption held by most politicians that they are somehow wise enough to reorder the vast complexities and emergent orders of the social world according to their own plans is the height of conceit. F.A. Hayek called it the fatal conceit, for when taken to its extreme, as occurred in the socialist experiments of the 20th century, it leads only to impoverishment, suffering, and death. But while politics may be dominated by power-hungry men and women, whose conceit leads them to view all social problems as requiring political solutions devised by them, this does not preclude individuals who may sincerely wish to decrease the power and abuses of the state from entering politics. The problem, however, is that immense barriers stand in their way. Not only are most Western nations dominated by a handful of political parties who have no intention nor incentive to shrink the state, but these same parties control and manipulate the voting process in ways which are greatly to their favor. Furthermore, those willing to cheat and lie in their efforts to get to the top are always at an advantage over their more honest competitors. In the modern game of politics, truth, honesty, and integrity do not pay. It is far easier to rally the masses around grand visions and false promises, even if such visions are impossible to implement or would have devastating side effects. A candidate who speaks the truth, who tries to convey to the masses the unsustainability or destructive nature of many government programs, is far less appealing. Reality pales in comparison to the fantasies put forth by most political candidates. Another element of mass elections which favors the morally corrupt is the fact that emotional appeals to hatred for one's opponents are extremely effective in rallying political support. This plays right into the hands of power-hungry demagogues who, in their myopic quest for victory, will use any technique to win, no matter how destructive to the fabric of society. Vladimir Lenin understood the power of hatred and negativity in garnering political support. "My words," he wrote, "were calculated to evoke hatred, aversion, and contempt, not to convince but to break up the ranks of the opponent, not to correct an opponent's mistake, but to destroy him." But even if a well-intentioned individual slipped through the cracks, beat the odds, and won a major election, there is the open question as to whether he could resist the corrupting influence of the modern state. For not only would the power at his disposal likely corrupt him, but he would be forced to contend with massive amounts of pressure from unelected bureaucrats, crony capitalists, and the many others who enrich themselves at the trough of state power. While some may continue to hold out hope for a political savior, perhaps a different approach is needed. Government oppression, or social predation in general, is at root a function of disparities of power. With a more equal distribution of power, the morally corrupt and evil elements of a society can do far less harm. But when one group or set of institutions becomes far more powerful than the rest of society, abuse is inevitable, whether we live in a democracy, monarchy, or under a dictatorship. Voting is unlikely to diminish the disparity in power created by the growth of the modern state. The past century has been full of elections, but over this same time the power differential between the state and citizen has only grown. A more effective approach for returning freedom to an increasingly unfree world may be found through the development and promotion of technologies and social and economic institutions that are free from the cold hands of the state. But unless the immense concentration of power held by the few that pull the strings of government is greatly diminished, it may not matter which of the candidates paraded before us we elect. For as H.L. Mencken recognized nearly a century ago, we really only have two choices in modern democracies. We can elect a demagogue, or what Mencken called a demislave. Under democracy, he writes, two branches reveal themselves. There is the art of the demagogue, and there is the art of what may be called the demislave. The demagogue is one who preaches doctrines he knows to be untrue to men he knows to be idiots. The demislave is one who listens to what these idiots have to say and then pretends that he believes it himself. Every man who seeks elective office under democracy has to be either the one thing or the other, and most men have to be both. No educated man, stating plainly the elementary notions that every educated man holds about the matters that principally concern government, could be elected to office in a democratic state, save perhaps by a miracle.
For it was a witty and truthful rejoinder which was given by a captured pirate to Alexander the Great. The king asked the fellow, "What is your idea in infesting the sea?" And the pirate answered with uninhibited insolence, "The same as yours in infesting the earth. But because I do it with a tiny craft, I'm called a pirate. Because you have a mighty navy, you're called an emperor." These words, written by St. Augustine, encapsulate one of the most fundamental problems of political philosophy. Namely, why governments are morally justified to take actions that no individual or group of individuals are permitted to take. Governments demand a portion of everyone's income, decide what substances may be consumed, regulate and restrict voluntary transactions, and even force individuals to fight their wars. These, among many other things, would be seen as ethically impermissible if undertaken by any individual or group other than one's government. Justifying this special moral status of government is known as the problem of political authority. In this video, relying on the work of contemporary philosopher Michael Huemer and his book The Problem of Political Authority, we will look at the various ways this problem has been approached. Before we begin, it should be noted that our purpose is not to examine whether government is beneficial or a prerequisite for an adequately functioning society, for as Huemer points out, the question is whether the government has certain special rights that you and I do not have, and whether we have certain special duties to the government that we do not have towards anyone else. A government, just like a private vigilante, could be highly beneficial and yet still lack authority. An easy and relatively uncontroversial way to justify political authority would be to say that people explicitly consent to it. This was the route that the 17th century philosopher John Locke took with his social contract theory. As the name implies, the social contract theory is based on the idea that there is a contractual relationship between the government and those governed. However, while Locke's theory is certainly famous, it is now largely of historical interest, because no such contract exists, nor has such a contractual relationship ever played much, if any, role in forming governments. The philosopher David Hume realized this and suggested that most governments were not formed by contract, but rather through conquest and war. The lack of evidence to support John Locke's theory has not led philosophers to completely abandon the consent theory of government. Rather, instead of suggesting that there is some form of explicit consent between the government and governed, it is now suggested that the consent is implicit. Implicit consent is consent granted not through any verbal or written communication, but through one's conduct. Huemer suggests that there are four main ways that people can potentially grant implicit consent to their government. Firstly, there is the case of passive consent. This is where one expresses agreement to a proposal simply by refraining from opposing it. The second case is that of consent through acceptance of benefits, arising when one commits oneself to accepting certain demands by soliciting or voluntarily accepting benefits to which those demands are known to be attached. The third type of implicit consent can be called consent through presence, arising when one indicates agreement to a proposal merely by remaining in some location. The fourth type Huemer identifies, which is called consent through participation, occurs when one implicitly consents to the rules governing a practice by voluntarily participating in the practice. At first glance, one might think that there is a good chance that at least one form of implicit consent justifies political authority, but under closer examination this becomes doubtful. As Humer points out, in order for a contract or agreement to be valid, whether based on explicit or implicit consent, it must satisfy certain criteria. For example, for an agreement between two parties to be valid, each party must have a reasonable way of opting out. However, short of abandoning one's home and the jurisdiction of one's government, there is really nothing one can do to opt out and prevent being subject to political authority. For this reason, all the implicit consent possibilities for political authority, except consent through presence, fail to meet this criteria of valid consent. As Humer explains, almost everyone knows that the state will still impose the same laws and the same taxes on one, regardless of whether one objects to the government, accepts a government service, or participates in the political process. Therefore, one's failure to object, one's acceptance of government services, and even one's participation in the political process cannot be taken to imply agreement. Another criteria for consent between two parties to be valid is the requirement that both parties have obligations to each other which, if unfulfilled, grants the other party adequate grounds for terminating the agreement. These days it may be difficult for people to agree on what exactly government is obligated to do, but most will agree that it includes enforcing the rights of citizens and protecting them from criminals both domestic and foreign. Whether one sees this as the only real obligation governments have, or if some claim governments have further obligations, the fact is that governments do not behave in accordance with the criteria of mutual obligation. There are innumerable historical examples of severe government failures to protect their citizens, and few, if any, examples of a government voluntarily abdicating power. In fact, government failures these days tend to result in increased government power, as more laws are passed on the assumption that they will prevent future failings. The inadequacies of the implicit consent theories to justify political authority have led some to suggest that consent arises through the will of a majority as expressed at the voting booth. The problem with this theory is that to accept it, one must also accept the premise that the opinions of a large group of people can somehow impose obligations on a smaller group. Some may accept this, but it is certainly a view which runs counter to common sense. For example, if you were out for dinner with 4 people, could the consensus of 3 of them that you pay the whole bill make you morally obligated to pay? Furthermore, this belief that majority opinion is enough to coercively impose obligations on minorities can lead to what is called the tyranny of the masses. Comments by some of the greatest thinkers in history reveal their distrust of vesting too much power into the will of a majority. Aristotle wrote, "Unlimited democracy is, just like oligarchy, a tyranny spread over a large number of people." Benjamin Franklin famously said, "Democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what they are going to have for lunch." And Edmund Burke made this comment, "Of this I am certain, that in a democracy the majority of the citizens is capable of exercising the most cruel oppression upon the minority, and that oppression of the minority will extend to far greater numbers and will be carried on with much greater fury than can almost ever be apprehended from the dominion of a single spectre." The difficulty of justifying political authority based on consent, whether it be explicit, implicit, or the consent of a majority, has led some to resort to what are called consequentialist arguments for political authority. The consequentialist argument suggests that the benefits that arise from vesting government with a special moral status are significant enough that they warrant the costs of obedience. Or in other words, political authority is justified by the beneficial consequences that arise from government action. For the consequentialist argument to hold, a government must be seen as providing benefits that outweigh the costs of obedience. And this has not always been the case, as the author Larkin Rose put it. Flip through any history book and you will see that most of the injustice and destruction that has occurred throughout the world was not the result of people breaking the law, but rather the result of people obeying and enforcing the laws of various governments. The evils that have been committed in spite of authority are trivial compared to the evils that have been committed in the name of authority. But even if one believes the benefits of government largely outweigh the costs of obedience, as many do, it is not clear how merely providing benefits can justify the special moral status associated with political authority. If providing benefits gives the individuals who make up government a special moral status, does it not follow that other groups should be able to obtain this special moral status if they provide significant benefits to society? It is doubtful that many people are willing to grant beneficial vigilantes the power of political authority, and so in reply to this question, one may claim that only a government can obtain the elevated moral status of political authority. But such a response would be begging the question, or in other words, assuming what must be proven. And what must be proven in this case is why governments have a special moral status that differentiates them from all others. This issue of how providing benefits can confer government, but no others, with a special moral status, coupled with the open question of just how beneficial governments are, makes the consequentialist argument difficult for many to accept. To conclude, while it is apparent that the problem of political authority is both an important issue and one which has not adequately been resolved, it is interesting that so few people pay attention to the issue. Perhaps David Hume was onto something when he wrote in the 18th century, "No maxim is more conformable, both to prudence and morals, than to submit quietly to the government, which we find established in the country where we happen to live, without inquiring too curiously into its origin and first establishment. Few governments will bear being examined so rigorously."
Resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. These were the words of caution which the great poet Walter Whitman offered to his fellow Americans. For Whitman recognized that crucial to a free and flourishing society are men and women who are willing to question and even resist authority when necessary. But today, very few of us live by the ideal espoused by Whitman. Rather, blind obedience is the norm. We have become populations of sheep, easily to be herded into the chains of tyranny. But what has led those of us in the West to largely shun the advice of Whitman? In this video, we will examine two institutions that have played an integral role in the breeding of a passive citizenry: the compulsory state-run education system, which in North America is called the public school system, and the mainstream media. Public schooling is viewed as one of the shining lights of the modern Western world. Who could question the value of an institution that provides free and compulsory education for all? But as with many institutions of our day, the textbook picture of how the institution should work greatly diverges from the reality of how it does work. If public schools taught individuals how to think, if they promoted intellectual curiosity and produced citizens healthy in body and mind, then few would question their value. But beneath the veneer presented by the bureaucrats that run this institution, a darker reality emerges. Or as John Taylor Gatto, a former teacher turned one of public schooling's greatest critics, writes, "Schools are intended to produce formulaic human beings whose behavior can be predicted and controlled. To a very great extent, schools succeed in doing this, but in a national order in which the only successful people are independent, self-reliant, confident, and individualistic, the products of schooling are irrelevant. Well-schooled people are irrelevant. They can sell film and razor blades, push paper and talk on telephones, or sit mindlessly before a flickering computer terminal. But as human beings, they are useless to others and useless to themselves." Noam Chomsky echoed this sentiment, writing in his book Understanding Power, "Given the external power structure of the society in which they function, the institutional role of the schools, for the most part, is just to train people for obedience and conformity, and to make them controllable and indoctrinated." To some this may sound like heresy, but a study of history reveals that this was the intention from the very start. The state-run school systems in the West were modeled off the factory style of education first introduced in Prussia in the early 1700s. "What shocks," writes Gatto, "is that we should so eagerly have adopted one of the very worst aspects of Prussian culture, an educational system deliberately designed to produce mediocre intellects, to hamstring the inner life, to deny students appreciable leadership skills, and to ensure docile and incomplete citizens, all in order to render the populace manageable." Albert Einstein, an individual who reached heights of genius rarely seen, did not credit his compulsory schooling with his intellectual development. Reflecting back on his school years, Einstein noted that after completing his final examinations, his interest in the field he would go on to revolutionize was all but dead. "I found the consideration of scientific problems," he wrote, "distasteful to me for an entire year." Einstein believed that one of the major flaws of compulsory state-run education systems is their forced style of teaching. It is, in fact, nothing short of a miracle, he wrote, that the modern methods of instruction have not yet entirely strangled the holy curiosity of inquiry. It is a very grave mistake to think that the enjoyment of seeing and searching can be promoted by means of coercion and a sense of duty. After well over a decade of indoctrination in the school system, few emerge with a great thirst for knowledge and a curiosity toward the many mysteries of the world. Instead, as Bruce Levine writes in his book Resisting Illegitimate Authority, by the time a student graduates, they have been bred to be passive, to be directed by others, to take seriously the rewards and punishments of authority, to pretend to care about things that they do not care about, and that one is impotent to change one's dissatisfying situation. But if our schooling cannot be relied upon to generate the critical and curious minds needed to protect a society from the actions of corrupted authorities, can the mainstream media play this role? While there has been an increasing skepticism toward this institution in recent years, distaste and distrust toward the mainstream media has a long history. "I have given up newspapers," wrote Thomas Jefferson, "in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid, and I find myself much the happier." Nietzsche, one of the most intellectually free and curious minds of history, was also no fan of the mainstream media. "Sick are they always. They vomit their bile and call it a newspaper." Richard Weaver, a professor at the University of Chicago in the first half of the 20th century, found it ironic that while we have freed ourselves from the earth-centered view of the cosmos, we have all the while dove headlong into an illusory view of the world created by the mainstream media. And while Weaver focuses on newspapers in the following passage, as they were the dominant medium of his day, his words are even more applicable today, where modern technology offers far better tools for the manipulation of the masses. A great point is sometimes made of the fact that modern man no longer sees above his head a revolving dome with fixed stars. True enough, but he sees something similar when he looks at his daily newspaper. The newspaper is a man-made cosmos of the world of events around us at the time. For the average reader, it is a construct with a set of significances which he no more thinks of examining than did his pious forebear of the 13th century think of questioning the cosmology. But why does the mainstream media so often choose deception over truth? Noam Chomsky, in his book Media Control, suggests that, like many politicians, the mainstream media is dominated by individuals who adhere to an elitist ideology. The 20th century journalist Walter Lippmann epitomized this view, calling the masses the bewildered herd, and suggesting that one of the main functions of the media is to put this herd in its proper place as passive spectators, not active participants, in the organization of a society. Or as Chomsky explains, this elitist ideology is built on the notion that the mass of the public are just too stupid to be able to understand things. If they try to participate in managing their own affairs, they're just going to cause trouble. Therefore, it would be immoral and improper to permit them to do this. We have to tame the bewildered herd, not allow the bewildered herd to rage and trample and destroy things. For those of us who are not among the self-anointed elite, the question arises as to whether the controlling of the bewildered herd is done in order to promote a prosperous and flourishing society, or merely to maintain certain institutional structures which favor the elites to the detriment of society at large. This open question only reinforces the need for a more skeptical attitude toward the authority figures of our day. We need, in other words, more anti-authoritarians. It must be stressed that an anti-authoritarian is not someone who, in place of a passive acceptance of authority, adopts a passive rejection of all authority. Many institutions and authority figures serve a beneficial purpose and therefore should be accepted. But anti-authoritarians recognize that consensus does not mean truth, that power corrupts, that people lie, and that some institutions, in the words of Chomsky, have no moral justification. They are just there in order to preserve certain structures of power and domination. Recognizing these undeniable facts, the anti-authoritarian is willing to look at all authority figures with a healthy dose of skepticism, and potentially even resist their commands if such authority proves corrupt and harmful to the well-being of a society. Or as Henry David Thoreau wrote, If the machine of government is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then, I say, break the law. But should we fear a world with more anti-authoritarians? The obedience bred into us in school and the blind deference to authority promoted by the talking heads of the mainstream media may lead some to view anti-authoritarians as a threat to the stability of society, but nothing could be further from the truth. Anti-authoritarians are the crucial protectors of a flourishing society, for as the author C.P. Snow noted, "When you think of the long and gloomy history of man, you will find more hideous crimes have been committed in the name of obedience than have ever been committed in the name of rebellion." Malevolent authority, combined with a passive citizenry, is the recipe for tyranny, and so anti-authoritarians should not be feared or ostracized. They should be welcomed. They are the individuals who raise the alarm and awaken the slumbering masses to the existence of corrupt authority. A society without a healthy number of anti-authoritarians, or a society in which anti-authoritarians are shunned and silenced, is a society that has chosen the comfort of illusions over the desire for truth, and is therefore a society paving the way for its own destruction. Or as the 18th century French philosopher Voltaire cautioned, "So long as the people do not care to exercise their freedom, those who wish to tyrannize will do so. For tyrants are active and ardent, and will devote themselves in the name of any number of gods, religious or otherwise, to put shackles upon sleeping men."
Simple reason. Modern societies are becoming ever more like the dystopia depicted in Orwell's most famous book, 1984. Whether it be mass surveillance, the incessant use of propaganda, perpetual war, or the cult of personality surrounding political leaders, it is not surprising that many see Orwell's novel as prescient in many ways. With that said, the West remains much freer than the dystopian society of 1984. But the trend does not bode well for those who favor a free society. Orwell, in fact, believed that totalitarianism of the type he satirized in his novel was a distinct possibility for the West, and at times he went as far as to suggest that it may in fact be inevitable. Almost certainly, he wrote in 1940, we are moving into an age of totalitarian dictatorships. In this video, we will look at what caused Orwell's pessimism, focusing on two trends in particular, the move toward collectivism and the rise of hedonism. Collectivism is a doctrine or set of ideologies in which the goals of a certain collective, such as a state, a nation, or a society, are given precedence over the goals of individuals. Socialism, communism, nationalism, and fascism are all collectivist ideologies. Orwell believed that a precondition for the rise of totalitarianism was the emergence of a collectivist social structure, as this permits the centralization of power needed to exert total societal control. Orwell's view of the connection between totalitarianism and collectivism has proved puzzling, as Orwell was a staunch leftist, a critic of capitalism, and a socialist. How could someone who favored socialism, a collectivist ideology, at the same time write a dystopian novel which portrays a collectivist society in such a horrific manner? To understand his position, it must first be realized that Orwell did not consider capitalism to be a viable system. It is not certain that socialism is in all ways superior to capitalism, he wrote, but it is certain that, unlike capitalism, it can solve the problems of production and consumption. Capitalism was such an inadequate system in Orwell's mind that, like many leftists of his day, he believed that it was on its deathbed and would soon be replaced by some form of collectivism. He saw this as inevitable. The issue for Orwell was what type of collectivism would take its place. The real question, he wrote, is whether capitalism, now obviously doomed, is to give way to oligarchy, totalitarianism, or to true democracy, democratic socialism. Following the impending death of capitalism, Orwell hoped that democratic socialism would be adopted in the West. Democratic socialists, like Orwell, advocated for a centrally planned economy, nationalization of all major industry, and a radical decrease in wealth inequality. They were also strong supporters of civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, which they hoped could be maintained in a society which would largely deprive people of their economic freedoms. The problem, however, which Orwell and other socialists had to grapple with were the lack of examples, either past or present, of any countries successfully adopting democratic socialism.
Even worse, the states that had turned to collectivism in the first half of the 20th century, such as Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, were becoming increasingly totalitarian. They were adopting what Orwell called oligarchical collectivism, not democratic socialism. Oligarchical collectivism is a system in which an elite few, under the guise of a certain collectivist ideology, centralize power using force and deception. Once in power, these oligarchs crush not only the economic freedoms of their citizens, a move which socialists like Orwell favored, but also their civil liberties. Orwell was concerned that following the death of capitalism, the entire Western world would perhaps succumb to oligarchical collectivism. This fear was in part due to his perception that hedonism was on the rise in Western societies. Hedonism is an ethical position that maintains that life's ultimate goal should be the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain and discomfort. In an increasingly urban and consumerist West, Orwell believed that many people were structuring their lives in a hedonistic manner, and this did not bode well for the freedom of Western civilization. A hedonistic lifestyle, according to Orwell, weakens people. It makes them feeble and incapable of mounting any resistance to fanatical ideologues who desire to rule over society. This fear of Orwell's has proven unfounded up to this point. While the West, since his death in 1950, has in many respects become more hedonistic, this has not led to totalitarian dictators taking over control. Rather, Aldous Huxley, the author of another famous 20th century dystopian novel, Brave New World, may have had a better grasp of the way Western societies would become enslaved in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Huxley, like Orwell, was an anti-hedonist, but his aversion to hedonism differed from Orwell's. Huxley's main concern was that hedonism could be used as an effective tool to oppress a society, because people will willingly forego freedom in exchange for sensory pleasure and endless consumption. If a society can be structured so that people can devote much of their time to pursuing pleasures, gratifying material wants, and even drugging themselves to escape from reality, then persuasion and conditioning, rather than physical coercion, will be sufficient to exert extreme control over a society. Neil Postman, in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, nicely contrasts the differing fears of Orwell and Huxley. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. In 1984, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we fear will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we desire will ruin us. The West, it seems, finds itself in a situation somewhat analogous to what Huxley feared. For like the proverbial frog in boiling water, citizens in the West accept greater and greater intrusions into their freedoms and with little resistance. The overt physical coercion that Orwell thought would be required to enslave a society has so far proved unnecessary. Before dismissing Orwell's fears completely, however, it must be noted that Orwell was familiar with Huxley's position, and he did not deny that the hedonistic society Huxley feared was a possibility. But he saw it as a temporary stage, creating the ideal conditions for a more brutal regime to seize control and impose its will on society. Whether Orwell will be proven correct in the end remains to be seen. Yet, as was pointed out, Orwell did not believe the totalitarianism which he feared could emerge in a society without it first becoming collectivist. So perhaps what has prevented his fears from coming true thus